Sarah Johnson moved with a quiet confidence that belied the years she had spent mastering the art of blending into her surroundings. Tonight, dressed in black leggings, a hoodie, and worn sneakers, she looked like any other jogger seeking solace in the crisp night air. The lakeside trail she frequented wasn't the kind of place most people chose to be after dark. It was remote, flanked by dense woods on one side and the still, dark water of the lake on the other. The only light came from the faint shimmer of the moon reflected on the water's surface. For Sarah, the trail wasn't just a place to clear her mind. It was a battlefield, a silent arena where she tested her endurance and reminded herself of the instincts that had kept her alive through missions most people couldn't fathom. Once she had been a top operative in the CIA, executing high-stakes operations in war zones and pulling information from places where trust was a liability and betrayal was a currency. But that life was behind her now, or so she told herself. The decision to leave had come after a mission gone wrong, one that left a village in ruins and shadows she could never quite shake. Since then, Sarah had retreated into a quiet existence, trading covert missions for advocacy. She now worked with a small non-profit, using her skills to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. It was fulfilling in its own way, but the thrill, the edge, was missing. Nights like this, when the silence stretched for miles and the faint sound of her shoes striking the gravel seemed to echo back at her, were the closest she came to feeling alive again. Unbeknownst to Sarah, the night was far from ordinary. Sitting in the dim glow of his patrol car, not far from the trail, was Officer Richard Hardy. Hardy had spent over a decade in law enforcement, but not out of a sense of duty or justice. For him, the badge was a tool and enabler for the darker parts of his personality he never cared to hide. He was a man embittered by his failures, stalled promotions, disciplinary reviews that hinted at misconduct, and an estranged family that wanted nothing to do with him. Hardy's authority wasn't about protecting the innocent, it was about control. His patrols often led him to places like this, where he could find people vulnerable enough to remind them of who held the power. Tonight, his gaze settled on Sarah. To Hardy, the sight of a lone black woman running through the trails set off an instant wave of suspicion. She didn't belong here, not at this hour, not in this space he silently claimed as his own jurisdiction. His grip tightened on the steering wheel, the itch for confrontation crawling up his spine. He watched her for a few moments through the smudged windshield of his car. The way her stride was even, her posture focused. Hardy didn't see discipline, he saw defiance, and in his mind, defiance had to be crushed. Sarah didn't notice the car at first. Her mind was elsewhere, running through the events of her day and the tasks that awaited her tomorrow. It wasn't until she rounded a bend in the trail and heard the crunch of tires on gravel that her senses sharpened. The headlights weren't on, but the low growl of the engine was unmistakable. She glanced back briefly and saw the shadow of a vehicle parked near the trailhead. Her instincts tingled something wasn't right. Years of training had taught her to trust that feeling, the one that whispered of danger before logic caught up. But she kept running, her pace steady, her breathing controlled. Panic was the enemy. Hardy's car moved, slowly at first, as though he were a predator circling prey. He waited until Sarah reached a clearing before flipping on his lights, the sudden brightness cutting through the darkness like a blade. The siren whooped briefly, a sharp burst that shattered the quiet night. Sarah stopped in her tracks, turning to face the car with an outward calmness that didn't betray the storm brewing inside her. The car door slammed as Hardy stepped out, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel as he approached. He kept his hand on his holstered gun, a gesture meant to intimidate, though Sarah didn't flinch. "Evening, Ma'am," Hardy said, his tone flat but laced with an edge of menace. "Mind telling me what you're doing out here?" Sarah's heartbeat quickened, but her voice was steady. "Just jogging. Is there a problem, officer?" Hardy's eyes narrowed, scanning her up and down. He didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably. It was a tactic meant to unsettle, but Sarah didn't take the bait. She met his gaze evenly, her years of fieldwork suppressing any hint of nervousness. "Kind of late for a jog, don't you think?" Hardy said finally, his voice dripping with condescension. "Not exactly the safest place for someone like you." Sarah knew what he meant. The emphasis on someone like you wasn't subtle. It wasn't the first time she'd heard it, and she doubted it would be the last. She had learned long ago that direct confrontation in moments like this rarely worked in her favor. Instead, she chose her words carefully. "I know this area well," she replied. "I'm comfortable here." Hardy smirked, a predator's grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Comfortable, huh? We'll see about that. ID, now." Sarah hesitated for the briefest moment, not because she had anything to hide, but because she knew this was no routine stop. Her identification was in her jacket pocket, but the gesture of reaching for it might escalate the situation. Still, she moved slowly, her hands deliberate as she unzipped the pocket and retrieved her ID. She handed it to Hardy without a word. He studied the card with exaggerated care, his thumb grazing over the raised text. "Sarah Johnson," he read aloud, as though testing the sound of it. "What do you do for a living?" "I work with a non-profit," Sarah said simply, withholding details she knew might provoke him further. Hardy didn't return her ID. Instead, he stepped closer, invading her personal space. "And what brings you out here, Sarah? Middle of the night, all alone. Doesn't seem like the kind of place for charity work." Sarah held her ground. "As I said, I'm jogging. Is there a law against that?" The smirk faded from Hardy's face, replaced by a glint of irritation. He wasn't used to people standing their ground, especially not someone he had already marked as inferior. His hand moved to his belt, fingers brushing the handle of his flashlight, though the motion wasn't lost on Sarah. She braced herself, ready for whatever came next. "I don't like your tone," Hardy said coldly. "Maybe you need to learn some respect." It was in that moment Sarah knew this wasn't going to end with a simple warning. Hardy wasn't here to enforce the law. He was here to assert his dominance. And for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, the one that told her a fight was coming. She didn't run. She didn't argue. She stood there, ready for the storm she knew was about to break. As Sarah stood her ground, her mind was already working 3 steps ahead. Every instinct told her that Officer Hardy wasn't going to let her walk away from this encounter unscathed. His posture, the sneer in his voice, and the way he loomed over her, like a predator circling its prey, all pointed to one thing: this wasn't a routine stop. He wasn't here to enforce the law. He was here to dominate, to remind her of who held the power, and he wasn't going to leave until he'd made that abundantly clear. "Turn around," Hardy barked, his tone sharp and commanding. The sudden shift in his voice from faux politeness to outright aggression was jarring, but Sarah didn't flinch. She had faced worse than this: men with guns, bombs strapped to their chests, moments where every second counted and a single misstep meant death. Hardy was dangerous, yes, but predictable in a way that most truly deadly men were not. She could see through him, past the badge and the uniform, to the insecure, angry man underneath. But that didn't make him any less of a threat. "What's the issue, officer?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice calm but firm. She needed to maintain control, to keep him talking long enough to gauge his intentions. If she reacted too strongly, he'd escalate. If she didn't react at all, he might take it as a sign of weakness. It was a delicate balance, and one she had perfected during her years in the field. Hardy's lips curled into a sneer. The issue is you're out here, in the middle of nowhere, acting suspicious. Now, turn around. Hands behind your back. Sarah hesitated. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the decision stacking up in her mind like a complex puzzle. She knew her rights, of course, and she also knew that Hardy didn't have probable cause to detain her. But she also knew that asserting those rights could escalate the situation beyond control. This wasn't about the law, it was about power, and Hardy wasn't going to back down without a fight. Suspicious, Sarah repeated, her tone measured. I'm out here jogging and I've complied with every request you've made. What exactly are you accusing me of? Hardy stepped closer, his hand hovering near his holster now. The implication was clear. Don't play games with me, he said, his voice low and menacing. You don't belong here. I don't know what you're up to, but I'm going to find out. Now turn around. Sarah knew she was out of options. Refusing would almost certainly lead to violence, and while she was confident in her ability to defend herself, she also knew that the situation could spiral out of control far too quickly. There were no witnesses, no cameras, nothing to hold Hardy accountable if he decided to take things too far. Her priority now wasn't just survival, it was de-escalation. All right, she said, her voice steady but laced with subtle defiance. I'll cooperate. But I want it noted that I've done nothing wrong. Hardy smirked, clearly taking her compliance as a victory. Noted, he said mockingly, gesturing for her to turn around. Sarah did as he asked, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. As she placed her hands behind her back, she felt the cold metal of handcuffs snap around her wrists, tighter than necessary. The bite of the steel was familiar, but no less unpleasant. It was a reminder of the control Hardy thought he had, and it only steeled Sarah's resolve. Let's see what you're hiding, Hardy muttered, pushing her toward the hood of his patrol car. He patted her down roughly, his hands lingering longer than necessary in places that made her skin crawl. Sarah clenched her jaw, forcing herself to stay calm. Reacting now would only give him the excuse he was looking for. When he found nothing on her, Hardy seemed almost disappointed. But instead of admitting defeat, he doubled down. "Where's your car?" he demanded. Sarah blinked, surprised by the question. "Why?" Hardy's eyes narrowed. "I asked you a question." Sarah didn't answer right away. Her car was parked a few hundred yards down the trail, hidden by the dense trees that lined the path. She had chosen the spot specifically because it was secluded, a habit born from years of operating in hostile environments. But now that same instinct might work against her. "It's down the trail," she said finally, her voice even. "Why?" Hardy didn't bother answering. He grabbed her arm and started walking, forcing her to keep up with his brisk pace. The gravel crunched under their feet as they moved deeper into the darkness, the only sound breaking the night's silence. Sarah's mind raced, cataloguing every detail: the weight of the handcuffs, the placement of Hardy's gun, the angle of his flashlight beam as it bounced across the trail. Every detail mattered. Every detail could mean the difference between life and death. When they reached her car, Hardy stopped, his grip tightening on her arm. "Open it," he ordered. Sarah turned her head slightly, raising an eyebrow. "How? My hands are cuffed." Hardy glared at her, clearly irritated. He shoved her toward the car, forcing her against the driver's side door. "I'll open it," he snapped, fishing her keys out of her jacket pocket with a level of aggression that made her blood boil. But she kept her composure, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. He unlocked the car and began searching it, tossing aside her belongings with reckless abandon. A water bottle clattered to the floor, followed by a first aid kit and a folded blanket. Hardy rifled through the glove compartment, his movements growing more erratic with each passing moment. When he found nothing incriminating, his frustration boiled over. "You're hiding something," he snarled, slamming the glove compartment shut. "I know it." Sarah didn't respond. She watched him carefully, noting the way his hands trembled slightly as he paced back and forth. He was unraveling, and she knew it. The question was how far he would go to prove himself right. Hardy seemed to make a decision then, his expression hardening. "Get in," he ordered, pointing to the back seat of her car. Sarah frowned, her instincts screaming at her to resist. "Why? Where are we going?" Hardy didn't answer. He grabbed her by the arm and shoved her toward the car, his grip bruising. "I said get in." Sarah hesitated for a fraction of a second before complying, climbing awkwardly into the back seat with her hands still cuffed. Hardy slammed the door shut behind her, locking it with a loud click. As he got into the driver's seat, Sarah felt the first pangs of real fear. Whatever Hardy was planning, it wasn't going to end at the station. The engine roared to life, and the car lurched forward, bouncing along the uneven trail. Sarah glanced out the window, her mind racing. They weren't heading back toward the main road. They were going deeper into the woods, toward the lake. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. She needed to think, to plan. Hardy might have the upper hand now, but she wasn't about to let him win. As the car approached the water's edge, Hardy brought it to a sudden stop. He turned to look at her, his eyes gleaming with a mix of triumph and malice. "You wanted to act like you're better than me," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "Let's see how tough you are now." Before Sarah could respond, he put the car in neutral and stepped out, leaving her alone as the vehicle began to roll forward. The front tires hit the water with a splash, and Sarah felt the car tilt forward. She took a deep breath, her training kicking in. She had seconds to act, and she wasn't about to waste them. The car's momentum carried it further into the dark, icy water, the front wheels sinking first as the lake embraced its new victim. Sarah Johnson remained calm, a skill ingrained in her through years of high-stress training. The cold realization of her predicament was immediate, but she fought back the panic rising in her chest. She didn't have time for fear. The vehicle tilted forward sharply, water seeping in through the seams of the doors as the murky depths swallowed the hood. She shifted her weight against the seat restraints, the handcuffs biting into her wrists, assessing her limited mobility. Hardy stood on the shore, arms crossed, his silhouette illuminated faintly by the patrol car's headlights in the distance. His expression, though partially obscured, radiated satisfaction. He believed the situation was firmly under his control, that he had reduced this defiant woman to nothing more than a silent casualty of the night. But what he saw as a final triumph was, for Sarah, only the beginning of a calculated response. As the water level rose inside the car, Sarah leaned back slightly to prevent herself from being fully submerged. The icy liquid crept up her legs, chilling her to the bone, but her mind remained razor-sharp. First, she tested the cuffs. The steel was unforgiving, tightly secured, leaving no wiggle room for her wrists. She glanced around the dimly lit interior, her instincts taking over as she surveyed her surroundings for anything that could be repursed as a tool. Her emergency kit, a gift from her former life, was stored in the compartment beneath the driver's seat. It was just out of reach, but she knew it contained a glass-breaking tool and a small blade, both of which were now her only chance at escape. The water surged up to her waist as the car tilted further, the rear wheels barely clinging to the lakebed. She twisted her body, straining against the cuffs, her fingers brushing against the seat's edge. Hardy's figure loomed in the distance, unmoving, as though he was savoring the sight of her imminent demise. She made a mental note of his position. His arrogance would be his downfall. Using the flexibility she had gained through years of combat training, Sarah bent her knees and maneuvered her feet toward the compartment. It was a painful process, her body contorted unnaturally, the cold sapping her strength with every second. Her shoes pressed against the edge of the storage latch, and with one forceful kick, she dislodged it. The compartment door popped open, its contents spilling into the water now lapping at her chest. Her toes grazed the familiar outline of the emergency kit, and she nudged it closer until it floated within reach. The car groaned under the weight of the water, tilting sharply as the rear tires lost contact with the ground. Sarah knew she had mere seconds before the vehicle would be fully submerged. Gripping the emergency kit with her cuffed hands, she managed to unzip it, her fingers trembling from the cold. The glass-breaking tool was the first thing she felt, its familiar shape giving her a jolt of hope. She angled it against the side window, steadying herself as best she could in the shifting car, and struck hard. The tempered glass cracked but held, requiring a second, more forceful blow. With a sharp snap, the window shattered outward, the pressure difference causing water to rush in with a deafening roar. Sarah inhaled deeply as the icy flood engulfed her. She twisted her body, forcing her shoulders through the narrow opening, the jagged edges of the shattered window scraping against her jacket. The lake's dark water surrounded her as she pushed herself free of the sinking car, her lungs burning as she swam upward. The weight of the handcuffs made her movements sluggish, but her resolve propelled her forward. Breaking the surface, Sarah gasped for air, her breaths ragged as she quickly oriented herself. The patrol car's headlights cast a dim glow across the lake, reflecting off Hardy's smug expression as he stood watching from the shoreline. He hadn't noticed her yet, too engrossed in the spectacle of the car disappearing beneath the surface. Sarah treaded water silently, her movements slow and deliberate to avoid drawing attention. She needed to act quickly and decisively. The cold gnawed at her muscles as she swam toward the opposite side of the lake, where the shadows of the dense forest offered temporary cover. Every stroke was a battle against her body's instinct to shut down, but she couldn't afford to falter. Reaching the shoreline, she pulled herself onto the muddy bank, her chest heaving as she lay still for a moment, the sound of her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Her eyes remained fixed on Hardy, who was pacing now, his body language betraying a hint of impatience. He thought she was gone, another nameless victim swallowed by the night. Sarah's mind raced as she planned her next move. Confronting Hardy head-on wasn't an option, not yet. She needed to regain the upper hand, and that meant using his overconfidence against him. She scanned her surroundings, her gaze falling on Hardy's patrol car parked a short distance away. The headlights illuminated a path that led back to the main road, but for now the vehicle was unguarded. She moved silently through the underbrush, her waterlogged clothes clinging to her body, each step calculated to avoid detection. Reaching the car, she crouched low, peering inside. The keys were still in the ignition, and the trunk was slightly ajar, a careless oversight on Hardy's part. Sarah opened it fully, her breath hitching as she took in its contents. Inside were several large bags of cement mix, a length of heavy chain and a crowbar. It didn't take much to piece together what Hardy's plan had been. The cement and chain were tools of finality, meant to ensure that whoever crossed him would never resurface. Her jaw tightened, a wave of cold fury washing over her. This wasn't just about her. He had done this before, and he would do it again unless she stopped him. Grabbing the crowbar, Sarah used it to wedge open a small compartment beneath the trunk floor, uncovering a hidden stash of items, confiscated wallets, IDs, and cell phones. The realization hit her like a blow to the chest. These weren't just random trinkets, these were trophies, tokens from his victims. Hardy wasn't just a bad cop, he was a predator, and she was determined to be his last. She slipped the crowbar into her belt and moved to the side of the car, where she crouched low, her breath fogging in the cold air. Hardy was still pacing by the water's edge, his figure silhouetted against the dim glow of the patrol car's lights. She knew she had to lure him closer, to create an opportunity to strike. Reaching into her pocket, she found her old tactical pen, a seemingly ordinary writing tool with a reinforced steel tip. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Sarah leaned against the car, angling herself so that her cuffed hands were braced against the steel frame. With a single powerful thrust, she slammed the pen into one of the tires, the air hissing out in a sharp, sudden burst. Hardy froze, his head snapping toward the sound. His hand immediately went to his holster as he started toward the patrol car, his movements quick and deliberate. "Who's there?" he barked, his voice cutting through the night. Sarah didn't respond, staying low as he approached. She could hear the crunch of his boots on the gravel, the faint jingle of the keys clipped to his belt. Her heart pounded in her chest. But she forced herself to remain still, every muscle in her body coiled like a spring. Hardy rounded the car, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. As he bent down to inspect the deflated tire, Sarah struck. She swung the crowbar in a tight arc, the blunt end connecting with his wrist and sending the flashlight clattering to the ground. Hardy let out a curse, stumbling back as he reached for his gun, but Sarah was faster. She closed the distance between them in a single fluid motion, using the crowbar to knock the weapon from his grasp. For the first time that night, Hardy's confidence wavered. He lunged at her, his hands outstretched, but Sarah sidestepped his attack, using his momentum against him. She drove her knee into his midsection, the impact forcing the air from his lungs in a wheezing gasp. He staggered, clutching his side, but his eyes burned with rage. "You think you're tough," he snarled, his voice hoarse. "You're nothing." Sarah didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her actions spoke louder than any words ever could. Hardy lunged again, but this time she was ready, using the crowbar to sweep his legs out from under him. He hit the ground hard, the back of his head striking the gravel with a dull thud. Before he could recover, Sarah pressed the tip of the crowbar against his throat, her weight pinning him down. "You underestimated the wrong person," she said, her voice low and steady. Hardy's eyes widened, the realization of his defeat finally sinking in. Sarah stared down at Hardy, the crowbar steady in her hands, her breathing labored but controlled. The weight of the moment hung between them, a silence broken only by the distant sound of water lapping at the shore and Hardy's ragged breaths. She could see it in his eyes, the realization that he had completely lost control. The predatory confidence, the smug superiority, all of it was gone, replaced by something raw and unfamiliar: fear. For a man who had built his career and identity on domination, it was an unbearable sight to behold. But Sarah knew this wasn't over. Not yet. She glanced down at the crowbar, her grip tightening as she considered her next move. Her mind was a whirlwind of calculations and scenarios, each one weighed and measured with clinical precision. She had neutralized Hardy for the moment, but he wasn't the kind of man to give up easily. He was already shifting beneath her, his eyes darting around, looking for an opening, a weakness. She couldn't afford to let him regain the upper hand. With a swift, calculated motion, Sarah pulled a set of keys from Hardy's belt her fingers brushing against the cold stale of his handcuffs. She leaned closer, her voice low and deliberate. "We're going to have a conversation, Hardy," she said. "But first, you're going to sit nice and still while I make sure you don't try anything stupid." Hardy glared at her, his lips curling into a sneer despite his vulnerable position. "You think you've won?" he spat. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Sarah didn't flinch. She had heard these threats before, from men far more dangerous than Hardy. She knew they were hollow, desperate attempts to regain control. Without a word, she flipped the crowbar in her hand and used the curved end to hook his belt, dragging it and the holster out of his reach. Then she reached for the handcuffs, looping them through the belt loop of his uniform pants before clicking them shut around a nearby metal bar on the patrol car's rear bumper. Hardy struggled against the restraints, his face twisted with anger, but Sarah ignored him. She stepped back, her eyes scanning the area, assessing her options. The night was cold, the air heavy with moisture from the lake. The patrol car's engine was still running, the faint hum a stark contrast to the stillness of the surrounding woods. Sarah's wet clothes clung to her skin, a reminder of the near-fatal encounter she had just survived. She felt the chill seeping into her bones, but she pushed it aside. There was no time to dwell on discomfort. She needed to act, and quickly. Her eyes fell on the trunk of the patrol car, still slightly ajar. She moved toward it, her steps deliberate, and pulled it open fully. The contents confirmed her worst suspicions. The bags of cement, the heavy chain, the assortment of tools, they weren't just signs of Hardy's intent to kill her. They were evidence of a pattern, a chilling testament to the lives he had likely taken before her. Her stomach churned at the sight, but she forced herself to focus. Emotions could come later. Right now, she needed to think like an operative. Digging deeper into the trunk, Sarah found a small bag tucked into the corner. She unzipped it, revealing an assortment of confiscated personal items, wallets, phones, keys. Each one told a story, and none of them ended well. She picked up a leather wallet, the edges worn and frayed, and opened it. The driver's license inside belonged to a young man, barely out of his 20s, his face smiling back at her in stark contrast to the grim reality of his fate. She thumbed through the other items, her anger building with each discovery. Hardy wasn't just a bad cop. He was a monster, and the system had allowed him to flourish. Behind her, Hardy laughed a low, guttural sound that sent a chill down her spine. "You really think you're going to do something with that?" he taunted. "You're just as dead as the rest of them. You just don't know it yet." Sarah turned to face him, her expression cold and unyielding. "Maybe," she said, her voice steady, "but I'm not like the rest of them. And neither is this situation." She pulled a phone from the bag and powered it on, the faint glow illuminating her face. The battery was nearly dead, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the information it held. She navigated to the photo gallery, scrolling through the images until she found what she was looking for. A series of time-stamped photos showed Hardy with various individuals, most of them young, most of them vulnerable. The settings varied: parking lots, deserted roads, wooded trails, but the pattern was clear. Hardy had been operating with impunity for years, using his badge as a shield and his victims as disposable pawns. The realization hit Sarah like a blow to the chest. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice. She couldn't let Hardy walk away from this, not with what she now knew. But she also couldn't afford to draw attention to herself. Her years in the CIA had taught her the value of staying under the radar, and this situation was no exception. She needed to end this quietly, decisively, and without leaving a trace that could lead back to her. Her fingers hovered over the phone's screen, her mind racing. She could upload the photos to a secure server, send them to someone who could use them. But even that wasn't enough. Hardy had connections, people who would protect him if this ever came to light. She needed to ensure he had no way out, no escape route that could save him from the consequences of his actions. Behind her, Hardy struggled against the handcuffs, his movements growing more frantic. "You don't get it, do you?" he growled. "People like me, we don't go down. You think anyone's going to believe you? You think anyone cares?" Sarah turned to face him, her gaze steely. "You'd be surprised," she said. She tucked the phone into her pocket and moved to the driver's seat of the patrol car. Sliding in, she glanced at the dashboard, noting the mounted camera. It was off, of course Hardy had disabled it before their encounter began, but the memory card might still contain something useful. She ejected the card and slipped it into her pocket, her movements precise and efficient. The engine idled softly, a faint hum that seemed to fill the silence. Sarah considered her next move carefully. She could leave Hardy here, tied to his own car, and disappear into the night. It would be poetic justice, and the evidence she had gathered would ensure he faced the consequences. But something about that felt unfinished, incomplete. Hardy deserved more than a simple arrest. He deserved to feel the weight of his actions, to understand the gravity of the lives he had taken. She stepped out of the car, her eyes fixed on Hardy as she approached. He sneered at her, his bravado still intact despite his vulnerable position. "What now?" he spat. "You gonna lecture me? Tell me how I'm a bad guy?" Sarah crouched down to his level, her face inches from his. "No," she said quietly. "I'm going to make sure you never hurt anyone else again." Hardy's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing as he tried to gauge her intent. "You don't have the guts," he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Sarah didn't respond. Instead, she stood and moved to the trunk, pulling out the heavy chain. Hardy's eyes widened as she approached, the realization of her intent dawning on him. "Wait," he said, his voice rising. "You can't do this. You're supposed to be the good guy." Sarah paused, the chain dangling from her hands. "That's where you're wrong," she said. "I'm not the good guy. I'm just the one who stops people like you." With that, she looped the chain around the car's axle, securing it tightly. Hardy watched in stunned silence as she worked, his bravado crumbling with every passing second. When she was finished, she stepped back, her eyes locking with his. "This is where it ends," she said. "For you, for everything you've done. It all ends here." As she walked away, Hardy's shouts echoed into the night, a desperate cacophony that faded into the distance as Sarah disappeared into the shadows. The air hung heavy with tension as Sarah moved away from Hardy, her mind calculating every possible outcome. She had left him restrained and helpless, but she knew better than to assume he would stay that way for long. Men like Hardy were survivors in their own twisted way, fueled by arrogance and a refusal to admit defeat. Her every step was measured, her soaked clothes clinging to her as she crept back toward the patrol car. She couldn't let this end here, not without ensuring that Hardy paid for everything he had done. There were still too many loose ends, too many risks he could somehow wriggle free and retaliate. The lake reflected the faint glow of the patrol car's headlights, the ripples on its surface a stark reminder of how close Sarah had come to death. Her muscles burned with fatigue, her lungs still raw from holding her breath during her escape, but she pressed on. The adrenaline coursing through her veins kept her moving, her focus unyielding as she approached the car from its blind spot. Hardy's voice cut through the night, a sharp bark of frustration as he struggled against his restraints. "You think this is over, huh?" Hardy shouted, his voice echoing across the water. "You think you've won? Let me tell you something, you don't just walk away from me. Nobody does." Sarah remained silent, crouched low behind the vehicle. She watched his reflection in the side mirror, his body jerking violently as he pulled against the cuffs. The sound of the metal scraping against the bumper was sharp and grating, but it told her something important. Hardy was growing desperate. Desperation made men like him sloppy, and Sarah intended to use that to her advantage. Reaching into the patrol car's open door, she retrieved the flashlight Hardy had dropped earlier. Its beam cut through the darkness as she swept it across the interior of the car, her eyes searching for anything she might have missed. Her gaze landed on the dashboard camera, its lens cracked but intact. She had already taken the memory card, but the device itself might hold more evidence, more pieces of the puzzle she needed to ensure Hardy could never walk away from this. She yanked it free with a sharp twist, tucking it into her pocket alongside the memory card. Behind her, Hardy's struggles intensified. He was shouting now, a mix of threats and obscenities, his voice growing hoarse from the effort. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he bellowed. "I've got people, you hear me? People who'll make you disappear just like that." He snapped his fingers for emphasis, the sound barely audible over the crunch of gravel beneath his boots as he writhed. Sarah's jaw tightened. She had heard men like Hardy make those kinds of threats before. It was always the same empty bravado meant to intimidate, to regain control of a situation they no longer held in their grasp. But Hardy didn't realize how little his words affected her. She wasn't some frightened victim. She was a woman who had faced death more times than she could count, who had stood toe-to-toe with men far more dangerous than him and lived to tell the tale. She circled the car, her movements silent and deliberate. Hardy's head snapped toward her as she stepped into view, the flashlight beam illuminating his face. His eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sneer. "You're not going to get away with this," he spat. "You think you're clever, but you're just another nobody who thought she could play with the big boys." Sarah didn't respond. Instead, she moved closer, her footsteps slow and methodical. Hardy tensed, his body coiled like a spring as though he were preparing to lash out. But the chains she had looped through the handcuffs and around the car's bumper held firm, keeping him in place, no matter how much he struggled. "Tell me something, Hardy," Sarah said finally, her voice low and calm. "How many people have you done this to? How many lives have you destroyed because you thought you could?" Hardy laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You think you're some kind of hero," he said. "You're nothing. Just another bleeding heart who thinks she can make a difference. Newsflash, sweetheart. The world doesn't care about people like you." Sarah stepped closer, the flashlight beam fixed on his face. "The world might not care," she said, "but I do. And I'm going to make sure you never hurt anyone again." Hardy's sneer faltered for a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. But he recovered quickly, his bravado returning in full force. "You're delusional," he said. "You think anyone's going to believe you. You think anyone's going to care about some thug who got what was coming to them." Sarah tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. "You've spent your whole life hiding behind that badge," she said. "But now, you're just another man who made a mistake you're not going to walk away from." Before Hardy could respond, Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out the memory card she had taken from the dashboard camera. She held it up, letting the light from the flashlight catch the metallic glint. "This is everything I need," she said. "Every word, every action, it's all here. And when the right people see it, your career, your connections, your entire life will come crashing down." Hardy's face twisted with rage. "You think that's enough to stop me?" he snarled. "I've got more power in my little finger than you could ever dream of. You're nothing." Sarah didn't flinch. She pocketed the memory card and stepped back, her gaze never leaving Hardy's. "We'll see," she said. But first, I need to make sure you don't go anywhere." She moved toward the trunk, retrieving the heavy chain she had left coiled there. Hardy's eyes widened as she approached, his struggles becoming more frantic. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice rising in pitch. "You can't do this. This is illegal. You'll go to prison for this." Sarah ignored him. She looped the chain around the car's axle, securing it tightly before threading it through the handcuffs once more. Hardy's movements became increasingly erratic, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "You don't have to do this," he said, his tone shifting to one of desperation. "We can work something out. Just let me go, and I'll forget this ever happened." Sarah straightened, her eyes locking with his. "You don't get it, do you?" she said. "This isn't about you anymore. It's about everyone you've hurt, and I'm going to make sure they get justice." Hardy opened his mouth to respond, but Sarah didn't give him the chance. She turned and walked away, her footsteps steady as she disappeared into the darkness. Hardy's shouts followed her, a mix of threats and pleas that faded into the night. Sarah didn't stop until she reached the edge of the lake, the cold water lapping at her feet. She stared out at the horizon, her mind racing with everything that had happened. She had survived the impossible, but the fight wasn't over. Not yet. There was still work to be done, still people who needed her to stand up for them. And as long as she was breathing, she wasn't going to stop. Sarah stood on the shoreline, the cold water licking at her boots, her gaze fixed on the dark silhouette of Hardy, still struggling against the restraints she had secured to his own patrol car. His shouts had quieted, replaced by labored breathing and the occasional growl of frustration as he twisted and jerked his arms in a futile attempt to free himself. The night was eerily still, the faint rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of crickets contrasting sharply with the chaos she had just survived. Every part of her ached from the deep chill of the lake's water still clinging to her skin, to the raw bite of the handcuffs that had cut into her wrists, but none of it mattered now. She was alive. Hardy was restrained, but the moment of triumph felt incomplete. Sarah wasn't here just to survive. She was here to finish this, to ensure that Hardy would never again use his position as a weapon against the innocent. The evidence she had gathered, the damning trophies in his trunk, the footage from his dashboard camera, and the photographs she had salvaged from his stolen victims was enough to destroy him in any courtroom. But the system that had protected men like Hardy for years wouldn't be dismantled so easily. She knew how quickly people in power closed ranks, how deeply entrenched corruption ran. She couldn't leave anything to chance. Hardy shifted against the bumper, his cuffs clanking against the chain as he craned his neck to look at her. Even now, beaten and bound, his expression was one of defiance. "What's the plan, huh?" he sneered, his voice hoarse but still dripping with venom. "You gonna kill me? Go ahead. You think anyone's gonna believe some nobody like you over me?" Sarah didn't respond immediately. She let the silence linger, her gaze unwavering as she stepped closer, her footsteps slow and deliberate. Hardy's sneer faltered slightly as she crouched down in front of him, the flashlight in her hand casting sharp shadows across his face. "No," she said finally, her voice low and steady. "I'm not going to kill you. That would be too easy." Hardy's brow furrowed, a flicker of confusion breaking through his bravado. "Then what?" he demanded. "You think you're going to turn me in? Good luck. You think anyone in the department's going to take your side? They'll bury you before you even make it through the door." Sarah tilted her head, studying him with the same clinical precision she had used on countless targets during her years in the CIA. "You really don't get it, do you?" she said. "This isn't about taking sides. This is about exposing the truth. And I have everything I need to make sure you'll never hurt anyone again. Hardy scoffed, but there was a nervous edge to his voice now. You're bluffing. You've got nothing. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out the memory card from his dashboard camera. She held it up between her fingers, letting the faint light from the patrol car's headlights catch the metallic glint. This says otherwise, she said. And so does everything else I found in your trunk. Hardy's face twisted with fury, his body jerking violently against the chain as he tried to lunge at her. You bitch, he spat, his voice a raw snarl. You don't know what you're messing with. You think this is over? I'll find you. I'll make you wish you'd never. Sarah didn't flinch. She rose to her feet, cutting him off mid-sentence with a sharp, deliberate motion. Enough, she said, her voice carrying an authority that silenced him. You've had your chance to talk. Now it's my turn. She moved to the patrol car, reaching inside to grab the crowbar she had used earlier. Hardy tensed as she approached, his eyes widening with a mix of fear and rage. For a moment it seemed as though he believed she might actually use it on him. But instead she crouched down by the front tire, the sharp edge of the crowbar slicing into the rubber with a practiced motion. The hiss of air escaping the tire was loud in the stillness of the night, a sharp punctuation to her silence. She repeated the action on the remaining tires, ensuring the car was immobilized. Hardy watched her, his chest heaving with each labored breath. You're insane, he muttered, his voice trembling slightly despite his best efforts to mask it. You're out of your damn mind. Sarah ignored him, her focus unbroken as she walked around the car, inspecting her work. The vehicle was now nothing more than a useless shell, incapable of taking Hardy anywhere, even if he somehow managed to free himself. Satisfied, she turned her attention back to him, her gaze cold and unrelenting. You've spent your entire career hiding behind that badge, she said, her tone cutting, using it as a weapon, as a shield. But tonight that ends. You wanted power. You wanted control? Well, now you've got nothing. Hardy's jaw tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line as he glared at her. But the fire in his eyes was dimmer now, replaced by a growing realization that he was no longer in control. You think you're better than me? He said finally, his voice quiet but laced with venom. You're just like me. You just don't want to admit it. Sarah didn't hesitate. No, she said firmly. I'm nothing like you. I fought for something bigger than myself my entire life. You? You've spent yours tearing people down to feed your own ego. And now you're going to face the consequences. She turned away from him, walking back toward the shoreline. The water was still, the ripples from her earlier escape long gone. She pulled out her phone, which had miraculously survived the ordeal, and powered it on. The screen flickered to life, and she navigated to the secure server she had used during her years in the CIA. It wasn't connected to any official agency anymore, but it was still active, her personal failsafe, a place where she could upload sensitive information without fear of interception. She inserted the memory card, her fingers steady as she selected the files for upload. The footage from Hardy's dashboard camera, the photos of the items in his trunk, the images she had taken of the cement bags and chains, all of it, was sent to the server with a single tap. When the upload was complete, she composed a message, attaching the files and addressing it to a trusted former colleague who still worked in the intelligence community. She didn't need to explain much. The evidence would speak for itself. As the message was sent, a weight seemed to lift from her shoulders. She turned back to Hardy, her phone still in hand, and approached him one last time. It's done, she said simply. By the time anyone finds you, your name, your reputation, everything you've built, it'll all be gone. Hardy stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he said nothing, his lips twitching as though he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Finally, he let out a low, bitter laugh. "You really think you've won," he said. "But people like me, we always find a way back." Sarah didn't respond. She knew better than to engage. Instead, she stepped back, her gaze unwavering as she turned and walked away, her silhouette fading into the darkness. Behind her, Hardy's voice rose once more, his threats and curses echoing across the lake. But Sarah didn't look back. She had done what she needed to do. The rest was out of her hands. As she disappeared into the woods, the first faint light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, casting a soft glow over the lake. The night was over, but Sarah knew her fight wasn't. Men like Hardy weren't the exception, they were the rule. And as long as they existed, she would be there to stand against them. She had survived the darkness once again, and now she was ready for whatever came next. The first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a pale golden glow over the lake and the surrounding forest. The water, still and glassy, mirrored the sky's changing hues as if it held no memory of the chaos from the night before. Sarah Johnson moved through the dense underbrush with practiced silence, her breaths even and measured despite the lingering chill of her soaked clothes. She had left Hardy behind, chained and powerless, his shouts fading into the distance as she disappeared into the shadows. But the night's events were far from over in her mind. Every detail, every decision replayed in sharp clarity as she navigated the winding trail back to her car. Her hands ached from where the handcuffs had dug into her wrists, the skin raw and bruised. The weight of exhaustion pressed on her shoulders, but she pushed it aside. Survival demanded focus, and even though she was out of immediate danger, her instincts refused to let her relax. Years of training had taught her that the end of the fight was often the most dangerous moment. Complacency was the enemy now, just as much as Hardy had been. The forest opened up into a small clearing where she had parked her own vehicle, hidden from view by a thicket of trees. Relief washed over her as the familiar shape of her car came into sight, undisturbed and exactly where she had left it. She approached cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of disturbance, but the quiet was undisturbed save for the occasional chirp of birds heralding the morning. It was almost too serene, as though the forest itself was trying to erase the violence of the night. Sliding into the driver's seat, Sarah took a moment to catch her breath. She leaned her head back against the headrest, closing her eyes as the weight of everything that had happened settled over her. Hardy's words still echoed in her mind, his threats a reminder of how deeply corruption had rooted itself in the system he represented. Men like Hardy didn't just operate in isolation, they thrived because they were protected by layers of complicity and silence. And while she had dealt a devastating blow to him personally, she knew the fight was far from over. The memory card sat in her pocket, a small but powerful piece of evidence. She had sent the files to her trusted contact, someone who could ensure they reached the right people, but the weight of responsibility still pressed on her. This wasn't just about Hardy. It was about every life he had destroyed, every victim who had been silenced. The thought filled her with a renewed sense of purpose, even as her body screamed for rest. Turning the key in the ignition, Sarah felt the engine roar to life beneath her. The sound was a welcome reminder of her autonomy, a stark contrast to the helplessness she had felt only hours earlier as Hardy had driven her car into the lake. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles whitening as she steadied herself. There was no room for hesitation now. She had survived for a reason, and it was time to make that survival count. As she pulled onto the narrow dirt road leading out of the forest, the events of the night began to blur together in her mind. Each moment felt both distant and immediate, like a scar that had only just begun to heal. The confrontation with Hardy, the sinking car, the icy grip of the water, every detail was etched into her memory, a reminder of how close she had come to losing everything. But instead of fear or regret, Sarah felt a quiet resolve building within her. She had faced death and won. Now it was time to ensure that her victory wasn't just personal. The drive back to civilization was uneventful, the forest giving way to winding rural roads and eventually the faint glow of streetlights on the horizon. The city was waking up, its residents unaware of the battle that had played out in the darkness just beyond their reach. Sarah navigated the streets with ease, her eyes sharp despite the fatigue gnawing at her. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, not yet. Her first stop was a small motel on the outskirts of the city, a place she had used before during her work with the CIA. It was unassuming, the kind of place where no one asked questions as long as you paid in cash. Sarah parked her car at the far end of the lot, away from the main entrance, and made her way inside. The clerk barely glanced at her as she handed over the money, sliding a key across the counter without a word. It was a temporary refuge, but it was exactly what she needed. In the privacy of the room, Sarah finally allowed herself to exhale. She peeled off her wet clothes, wincing as the fabric clung to her bruised skin, and stepped into the small bathroom. The hot water of the shower was a welcome relief, washing away the grime and the cold that had seeped into her bones. She let it run over her for longer than she needed, her mind still racing even as her body began to relax. When she emerged, wrapped in a thin towel, she sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out her phone. The memory card was still safe in her pocket, but she needed to confirm that her contact had received the files. Opening the secure messaging app, she found a single unread message waiting for her. The words were simple but carried immense weight. Received. Evidence verified. Action underway. Keep your head down. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't a victory, at least not yet, but it was progress. The files were no longer her responsibility. They were in the hands of someone who could use them, someone who understood the stakes as well as she did. For the first time since the night had begun, she felt a flicker of relief. But even as she allowed herself a moment of respite, the reality of what lay ahead began to settle in. Hardy was just one man, a symptom of a much larger disease. The system that had enabled him, that had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long, was still intact. And while the evidence she had gathered would expose his crimes, it wouldn't dismantle the machine that had protected him. Sarah leaned back against the headboard, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as her thoughts swirled. She had spent her life fighting battles in the shadows, working to dismantle threats before they could reach the surface. But this was different. This wasn't a faceless enemy or a distant war zone. This was home, and the fight was far from over. She reached for her phone again, opening the secure server where she had uploaded the files. A new folder caught her eye, one that hadn't been there before. It contained additional evidence, testimonies, photographs, documents, all tied to Hardy and his network. Her contact had done more than verify her files. They had begun building a case, one that extended far beyond the events of the night. Sarah's resolve hardened as she scrolled through the folder, each piece of evidence a reminder of what was at stake. She had survived the night, but her fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The morning sun broke through the thin curtains of the motel room, casting a warm glow over the sparse furnishings. Sarah stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the light. She felt the weight of the memory card in her pocket, the bruises on her skin, and the fire in her chest. Hardy had underestimated her, as had the system that had allowed him to thrive. But they wouldn't make that mistake again. As she stepped out of the motel room and into the light of day, Sarah felt a quiet determination settle over her. She had faced death and walked away. Now, she was ready to face whatever came next. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly alive. And she wasn't going to waste a second of it.